The rain came down soft and steady over the cemetery, a cold drizzle that soaked through jackets and gave the whole place a heavy, somber weight. The American flag draped neatly over the dark oak casket barely moved in the breeze. Soldiers stood in perfect formation, eyes forward, unmoving, the kind of respectful stillness that felt carved out of stone. Friends and family gathered around the grave, faces pulled tight with grief, some crying quietly, others just staring, blank and lost. Among them stood a large German shepherd named Riggs, Sully Hayes' loyal service dog and constant companion through the chaos of war and the quiet of retirement. Usually, Riggs was calm, almost statuesque, trained to sit for hours without a single bark. But that day, something was different. From the moment they arrived at the gravesite, Riggs seemed off. He paced in tight circles, pulling at the leash held by Callahan Vickers, Sully's old war buddy. His ears twitched constantly, nose in the air like he was searching for something that no one else could see or smell. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Riggs let out a deep, unsettling growl. His buddy tensed, then suddenly he lunged forward, yanking the leash so hard Callahan nearly lost his grip. Riggs barked loud, sharp, and unrelenting. It wasn't a bark of confusion or excitement, it was panic, fear, warning. Everyone froze. A few guests stepped back, murmuring to each other. Marley Hayes, Sully's daughter, clutched a tissue to her lips and whispered, "What's wrong with him?" But no one had an answer. The dog clawed at the dirt, digging with frantic urgency, like he was trying to reach someone. People tried to calm him down, but nothing worked. Riggs wasn't just reacting to the ceremony, he was reacting to what was in that grave. It was like he sensed something was deeply, horribly wrong. His barking grew louder, more aggressive, echoing across the cemetery grounds. Even the soldiers, trained for crisis, looked uneasy. The tension in the air shifted. What should have been a final, peaceful goodbye suddenly felt off. Delaney, Sully's widow, her face pale and stunned, stepped forward and, with a shaking voice, said the words no one expected, "Open the casket." For a few seconds, no one moved. It was the kind of thing you didn't do, not at a military funeral, not after all the preparation, not in front of a grieving family. But something in her voice, a desperate certainty, cut through the stillness. The funeral director hesitated, but Callahan gave a nod. And as the gravediggers approached the casket with wary hands, the only sound that remained was the sharp, rhythmic barking of a dog who knew what the rest of them didn't, that whatever they thought they were burying wasn't Sully Hayes. There was a long, tense pause after Delaney's request, like the world itself had stopped breathing. The funeral director looked around for confirmation, unsure if he was even allowed to do what she'd asked. But when Callahan Vickers gave a slow, solemn nod, the men with shovels stepped forward, exchanging uncertain glances. The wind had died down, and the sound of dirt being brushed off the lid filled the silence like static. Everyone watched, frozen, as the coffin was carefully pried open. The hinges creaked, stiff and reluctant, and the lid slowly lifted. What should have been a final goodbye suddenly turned into something much darker. A wave of dread swept over the crowd as eyes landed on the body inside. Callahan was the first to really look, and then he stopped, mid-breath, his face draining of color. It wasn't Sully. The man in the casket wore a military uniform similar to Sully's, but the details were off, different insignia, medals out of place. But it wasn't just the clothes. The face, though similar, wasn't his. Marley's hand flew to her mouth. Delaney gasped, staggering backward as her knees buckled. But then someone noticed something even worse. The hands, someone whispered. The man's wrists were red and bruised, clear signs they'd been tightly bound. Rope marks. There was no mistaking it. Whoever this man was, he hadn't died peacefully. He hadn't even been laid to rest with care. He had been put there, hastily, cruelly, and intentionally. The weight of that realization fell hard on everyone. The horror was raw and immediate. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a cover-up. And Sully, he wasn't in that casket. He was missing. Riggs had gone silent now, standing perfectly still beside the coffin, his ears pinned back, his body stiff. He growled low, a guttural sound that seemed to confirm what everyone feared: something was terribly wrong. Callahan stepped forward, his military instincts flooding back. "Who prepped this body?" he barked at the funeral director, whose face had gone pale as chalk. The man stammered something about the body arriving through proper military channels, about protocol, about things that were supposed to make sense, but nothing did. Lane stared down at the stranger in the coffin, her voice shaking with fury and fear. "Does that look like someone who died in their sleep?" Murmurs spread. Panic flickered in every eye. Marley checked her phone, frantically scrolling through records. "Dad's flight landed 2 days ago," she whispered. "I tracked it myself. He was supposed to be here." Her words hung in the cold air like smoke. Then, without warning, the casket shifted. A soft, unnatural thud came from inside. People jumped back. Someone screamed, and for a moment, nobody moved. Everyone was staring, wide-eyed, breathless, at the body that had just moved inside the coffin. The sound of that dull thud froze the entire cemetery. No one spoke, no one breathed. The weight of disbelief hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody could see. Riggs growled again, deep and low, his eyes locked on the open casket. Callahan Vickers took a step forward, his hand trembling slightly as he reached down, pressing 2 fingers to the stranger's neck. The skin was ice cold. For a second, he thought it was nothing, just the last twitch of a dead body settling. But then there it was, faint, almost imperceptible, but real. A pulse. His heart skipped. "He's alive," Callahan muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Gasps erupted from the crowd like a wave breaking. People stumbled back. Marley clutched her chest. Lane looked like she might collapse. Wallace Grayson, the funeral director, stammered in disbelief. No, that's not possible." The military confirmed he was declared dead, but the man in the coffin wasn't done. His chest started to move shallow, rapid breaths, like someone coming up from underwater. His fingers twitched, his lips cracked open as he tried to speak. Then, through all the pain and confusion, came a sound no one expected. A whisper, dry and raspy. "Help me." That was all it took. Panic rippled through the mourners. Several people backed away, others rushed forward. Callahan grabbed the man's arm and leaned in, trying to keep him grounded. "Stay with me," he urged, his voice firm but shaken. The man tried to speak again, his eyes wide and unfocused, darting from face to face. Lane stared at him, horrified. "Who is he?" she whispered. "Where's my husband?" Marley, her hands trembling, turned to her mother. What if Dad is still out there? The thought hit like a freight train. If this wasn't Sully, then where was he? And who had gone to such lengths to hide the truth? As the man struggled to speak, his lips formed 2 words that made Callahan's blood run cold. They lied. The words were barely audible, nearly swallowed by the wind, but they landed like thunder. Callahan gripped his arm tighter, eyes locked on his. Who lied? What happened to Sully? But the man's body seized, convulsing violently. A horrible choking sound rose from his throat. His back arched, his breath grew ragged, and then, just like that, he was still. The fragile pulse disappeared beneath Callahan's fingers. Dead. Again. For a moment, no one moved. Lane was crying now, silent tears streaking her face. "He was alive," she whispered, her voice cracking. We saw it. Wallace looked like he might be sick, mumbling to himself about protocols and channels, unable to process what had just happened. But Callahan's military instincts were firing on all cylinders. This wasn't a mix-up. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had tried to bury a man alive, and they'd nearly gotten away with it. And whoever was behind this wasn't done yet. The air was thick with confusion and dread. Callahan stood at the edge of the open casket, fists clenched, eyes locked on the body that had just come back to life and died all over again. His mind raced. If this wasn't Sully, then where the hell was his friend? This wasn't some logistical screw-up. Bodies don't get swapped like luggage. Someone had intentionally buried the wrong man, and whoever he was, he'd been tied up, silenced, and left to rot in Sully's place. Lane's voice was shaking. "This doesn't make sense," she kept repeating, barely above a whisper. Marley was already pulling out her phone again, flipping through emails, flight logs, military reports. "Dad's body landed in the US 2 days ago," she said, her voice rising in panic. "I checked the tracking myself. He was supposed to be transferred directly here. So, where is he?" The question sat heavy in the air. No one had an answer. That's when Riggs barked once, sharply, his body rigid, muscles taut. Without warning, the dog tore off toward the cemetery gates, leash still attached and dragging behind him. Callahan didn't hesitate. "Riggs has a scent!" he shouted, already sprinting after the German shepherd. Lane and Marley shared a stunned glance before taking off behind him, their footsteps crunching across the wet grass. The funeral had transformed in seconds from a quiet farewell into a frantic search. Riggs led them through the gates and toward the woods bordering the cemetery, his nose low to the ground, tail stiff with focus. Callahan's gut twisted. Whatever Riggs had picked up, it was recent. Within moments, they reached the edge of the trees and the dog stopped abruptly. Callahan crouched beside him, scanning the ground. That's when he saw them footprints, deep and fresh, leading away from the cemetery. Not from guests. These were hasty, deliberate. Someone had been watching. Someone had been there. Marley caught up, breathless. Those prints. They're new, she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Who would have been out here? Lane swallowed hard, hugging herself tightly. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Callahan nodded grimly. He recognized the signs this was no coincidence. Whoever orchestrated the switch had stuck around to make sure it went off clean. But something had gone wrong. The wrong man had survived, even if only briefly. They had seen too much now. We need to follow the trail, Callahan said, and Riggs was already moving again. They pushed into the trees, the light from the cemetery fading behind them. The woods were quiet, too quiet, the air cold and damp. Every crunch of leaves beneath their boots echoed louder than it should have. Callahan's military training kept him sharp eyes scanning, hand resting near his sidearm. Deeper into the forest, they found more footprints, and then something else. A torn piece of military fabric snagged in a bush. Nearby, half buried in the dirt, was a glint of metal. Lane rushed over, heart in her throat, and pulled it free. A dog tag. Sullivan Hayes. Her knees buckled. He was here, she breathed. He left this. Hope and terror warred in her chest. If Sully was alive, he was trying to tell them. But what else was waiting in the woods? Riggs took off like a shot, snarling as he bounded deeper into the forest, driven by something only he could sense. Callahan's heart leapt into his throat. Riggs, he shouted, sprinting after the dog without a second thought. Branches whipped across his arms as he pushed through the thick brush, his boots sinking into the damp earth. Lane and Marley struggled to keep up, breath coming in ragged gasps. The woods were darker here, quieter, like they were being swallowed whole. Then came the sound, a low, pained groan that froze them in place, human, weak, close. Callahan's adrenaline surged. He ran faster, limbs burning until he broke through the thicket and saw it. A man slumped at the base of a tree, barely conscious, wearing a dirt-streaked, blood-stained military jacket. Riggs was beside him, nudging his arm with his nose, whimpering. Callahan's chest tightened. He didn't need to see the face to know. Sully, he whispered, dropping to his knees. Lane fell beside him, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Her hands hovered, shaking just above her husband's face, too afraid to touch him, like he might vanish. Callahan checked for a pulse. Faint, but there. He's alive, he said, barely able to believe the words. Sully's eyes fluttered open, bloodshot and distant. He stared at Lane like he was trying to remember if she was real. Lane, he rasped, the name barely making it past his cracked lips. She choked out a sob and brushed her fingers across his cheek. Marley collapsed beside her, gripping her mother's shoulder, overcome with emotion. Callahan moved quickly, slipping an arm under Sully's back, trying to lift him gently. We've got to get him out of here. Sully winced, his body locking up with pain. His grip tightened on Callahan's sleeve. Wait, he croaked, eyes wide with fear. Not safe. They're coming. The warning hit Callahan like ice water down his spine. He turned, scanning the trees. The hairs on his neck stood up. They weren't alone. Footsteps. Several sets, moving fast through the underbrush. Lane clutched Sully's hand. Marley's eyes darted in every direction. Riggs growled again, his whole body tense. Then a voice came from the shadows, cold, flat. You weren't supposed to find him. 3 figures emerged from the trees, dressed in dark, military-style clothing. One of them stepped forward, his face expressionless, eyes sharp as razors. We're just here to clean up the mess, he said. Lane gasped, shielding Sully with her body. Who are you? She demanded. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. You should have left him in that grave. Callahan didn't wait. As the man reached for a weapon, Callahan lunged, slashing his knife across the attacker's arm. Riggs flew into action, tackling another one to the ground with teeth bared. Chaos exploded in the woods, fists, gunshots, screams. Callahan fought like hell, fueled by fury. He pinned one of the attackers, growling, "Who sent you?" The man just smiled through bloody teeth. You already know. Callahan didn't care. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, Sully was alive and they weren't leaving him behind. The silence after the fight was as loud as the chaos that had come before it. One attacker lay unconscious, the other groaning in the dirt, clutching a bleeding leg where Riggs had torn through muscle. The third, clearly the leader, was pinned beneath Callahan's knee, his face smeared with blood, his lips split but still curled in a smug grin. Lane held Sully close, his body trembling, breath shallow but his eyes, though full of fear, were alive. Marley crouched nearby, arms wrapped around herself, too stunned to cry anymore. Callahan pressed the barrel of the stolen handgun against the man's chest. "If you come after us again, I won't miss," he warned, voice low, steady. The man just laughed, voice rasping. "You think this is over? You just opened the door." He coughed, spit blood onto the leaves. "This is only the beginning." But Callahan didn't wait for more riddles. He stood, breathing hard, then turned to Lane, gnarly. "We're leaving, now." With Sully's arms draped over their shoulders, they moved fast through the woods. Riggs stayed close, still growling now and then, every sense on alert. No one spoke. The only sound was the crunch of leaves and the labored breathing of the man they'd just saved from a grave he was never meant to crawl out of. The further they got from the clearing, the more the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. This hadn't just been a rescue. It was a message. Sully had been targeted by someone with the resources to fake military records, forge transfer orders, and plant a bound man in a coffin under a hero's name. And even worse, they almost got away with it. Callahan knew what they were up against now. This wasn't just some rogue agent or paperwork error. This was a machine, something bigger than any of them that didn't care who it chewed up or buried, but they had one thing it didn't, the truth. And it was still breathing barely. They made it out of the woods before dawn. An ambulance met them at the cemetery gates, called anonymously by Marley in a shaky whisper. Sully was rushed into care, and though he had a long road ahead, he was alive against all odds. The rest of them stood in the quiet morning light stained with dirt and blood, watching as the flashing lights disappeared into the distance. None of them were the same people who had walked into that funeral the day before. And maybe that's the point. Sometimes the truth doesn't come wrapped in ceremony or spoken in folded flags. Sometimes it barks, claws at the dirt, and refuses to stay buried. In a world where systems can fail, where the ones we trust to protect us can be the same ones hiding the worst of it, it's the loyal ones, like a restless dog at a grave, who remind us to look again. The lesson here isn't just about Sully. It's about listening to your gut, questioning what you're told, and never assuming that silence means peace. Because sometimes the scariest lies are the ones buried 6 feet deep, and the bravest thing you can do is dig. The group moved as quickly as they could, Sully's weight slung between Callahan and Lane, his every step marked by a wince of pain. Riggs scouted ahead, ears alert, body tense, occasionally glancing back to make sure they were still following. The forest was beginning to lighten, the sun crawling slowly through the thinning trees, casting pale gold light over the soaked ground. Sully's breathing remained shallow, but his grip on Callahan's jacket tightened. "You need to know," he rasped. "It's not just me." Callahan slowed, looking over. "What do you mean?" Sully coughed hard, blood bubbling at the edge of his mouth. "They've done this before. Others. Soldiers. Who saw too much." His voice broke. "They made us disappear." The words hit like a sucker punch. Lane stopped in her tracks. "You're saying this is part of something bigger?" Sully nodded, barely. "We weren't just soldiers. We were part of an operation. Covert. Off the books. Things we saw. Things we were told to forget." Marley pulled out her phone again, trying to find any trace of what her father was referring to. "I don't understand. What operation?" Callahan looked grim. "Black files. The kind that don't exist on paper." Sully met his eyes. "Exactly. They covered their tracks by burying us literally." Lane was shaking. "How many?" she whispered. Sully didn't answer, but the silence said enough. Riggs whined softly as if he too understood the gravity of what was being revealed. The group finally reached a clearing near an abandoned ranger station. It was here they stopped to rest, setting Sully down against a mossy log while Marley tried to boost a signal for a call. "If there are others," she said quietly, "we need to expose it." Sully's hand trembled as he pointed to a pouch inside his torn jacket. Callahan opened it and found a small flash drive, inside muddy but intact. "Everything's on there," Sully murmured. "Names, photos, missions. The ones they buried." Callahan stared at the drive like it was a live wire. If what Sully said was true, This wasn't just about saving one man, it was about uncovering a system built to erase the truth. As the forest rustled around them and Riggs kept watch at the tree line, they all knew what came next. Getting this drive to safety would mean painting a target on all their backs. But after everything they had seen, none of them could walk away now. By the time the sun fully broke through the trees, the quiet of the forest felt deceptive, like the calm before a storm. Lane helped Sully sip from a canteen while Callahan inspected the flash drive. "We need to get this to someone who can't be bought," he muttered. "The press, maybe, or a whistleblower network." Marley nodded. "Encrypted it first, then spread it wide." But Sully shook his head weakly. "It won't be that easy. They monitor comms, track movement. They'll know the second the drive goes live." Callahan looked at him. "So what do you suggest?" Sully hesitated. "We go public, face to face, tell my story, tell all of it, on record, on camera. Make it impossible for them to bury me again." The idea was bold and dangerous, but it might be the only way. The group made it back to town by nightfall, slipping into an old motel under fake names. Riggs stayed alert by the door, ears twitching at every creak of wood. Sully, wrapped in bandages and lying on the bed, began dictating everything he remembered while Marley recorded it on her phone. Operation names. Commanders. Missions that ended in silence. It was hard to listen to, even harder to process. Lane held his hand through most of it, tears in her eyes, while Callahan paced, already thinking 3 steps ahead routes. Out of town, safe contacts, worst-case scenarios. They all knew this wasn't over. Once the story broke, there would be retaliation. But if they stayed silent, more families might bury coffins filled with strangers. In the days that followed, Sully's story began to spread. Anonymous drops to reporters. Fragments of the audio shared on forums. Then a viral post accompanied by a single photo. Riggs, sitting guard beside the wrong casket. It caught fire. The military issued a brief statement denying any wrongdoing, but the momentum had already started. Other families stepped forward, names surfaced, patterns emerged, and the truth, it clawed its way out of the grave. Lane, Marley, Callahan, and Sully, against all odds, had opened a door that couldn't be closed. But it came at a cost. They stayed on the move, never sleeping in the same place twice, always watching. Yet even in exile, they knew they'd done the right thing. Because the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always try to breathe, and sometimes it takes a loyal dog's bark to make the world listen.